Um, we might have some other folks come in and join us, but at least we are here for the moment. Okay. So we're going to start our discussion about Judaism this morning. Um, and be mindful that your first response paper and your first paper on a religious tradition are both due this Friday. So just keep that in mind. And if you have questions, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about it as we get a little closer. But if you have questions, you can ask them specifically about that, or you can shoot me an email or whatever. So but I just want you to remember that those are coming up. So as I said at the outset of this class a week ago, there's roughly 16 million Jews in the world. And the majority of the Jews live in two countries, the nation of Israel and the United States, each of which have about 6.5 million Jews or so living in them. So as you can see, the great majority of the Jewish population lives in these two countries, and then are the rest of the 1 million-ish or so, 1.5 million or so, are scattered around the world, obviously mostly living in European countries. Jews who live outside of Israel are part of what's known as the Jewish diaspora. And that means the dispersion of Jewish people into non-Jewish lands. And this diaspora started all the way back in 586 BCE. So it's been a long process. And therefore, for most of the history of the Jewish people, they have lived really in diaspora and have not lived really as a nation state for a long period of time. Also, and we'll look more at this, but Jewish tradition has maintained that the scripture contains 613 religious commandments, or what are known as mitzvot. And for those of you that may practice a Christian faith, part of those 613 Jewish laws or commandments are what Christians know as the 10 Commandments. And so those are just 10 of the 613. And so in Jewish religious tradition, and we'll see more of this in a minute, but to be a faithful Jew really means to follow all 613 of these commandments and laws. The great majority of them appear in the book of Leviticus and Numbers, and they're interspersed obviously in Exodus and Deuteronomy, where the 10 Commandments appear as well. But just for an example, some of these other commandments have to do with the shoring of hair. There's specific ways that Jewish males have to keep their hair. You can't wear mixed fibers, and what that commandment means is obviously in the days of old, a mixed fiber would have been like wool and cloth, cotton, for example. Today, a mixed fiber might be cotton and polyester or something like that. But if you want to maintain faithfulness in Judaism, you can't wear these mixed fibers. And so, and one of the things that's important for us to understand, and then we'll move on, is that these 613 commandments are held in parity. They're considered equal. So the dietary laws that you find around keeping kosher and these laws about not wearing mixed fibers are the same as the laws of not lying or stealing that you find in what we might call, what Christians would call, the 10 Commandments. And so one of the important things for us to see is that while we may weight these in our own societal offerings, for a faithful Jew, these 613 commandments or mitzvah were really supposed to be held equally. And so there wasn't a difference between the way someone was supposed to cut their hair and the type of fibers they were supposed to wear, or the food they were supposed to eat. And I think that's important for us to understand, because one thing it helps us to understand is that Judaism is, and I'll talk about this later, is what we would call ethical monotheism. And so ethical monotheism relates greatly to their understanding of one God, Yahweh, but also of living in an ethical universe, if you will. All right. Jews understand ultimate reality. And remember, when we started this course a week ago, I talked about ultimate reality being the thing in religion that you hold most important or most supreme. They understand ultimate reality as both the creator of the world and the God of the particular people known as the Jews. And they name that God Yahweh. And we'll talk more about where that name comes from in a bit. But the ultimate reality in Judaism is this God that created the universe and is the personal God of the people of Israel, known as Yahweh. And God entered into a covenant with Abram. If you don't know this, Abram became Abraham, and this is where we get the notion or the term Abrahamic faith tradition. And so Abrahamic faith tradition is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because all three of those traditions recognize Abraham as the father of faith. And so that's why we call these three religious traditions Abrahamic faith traditions. That's also why we're going to look at them now this week, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where, because they all fall under this larger rubric of the Abrahamic faith tradition. And the purpose of the covenant was to establish Abraham and his descendants as the people who would be loyal to this God that became known as Yahweh, and that they would and would play a distinctive role in human affairs. And so, hold on one second. John is trying to join us as well. All right. Anyway, so this God Yahweh and this man Abram, whose name was changed to Abraham, met. And some of you may know this story, and we'll talk more about it in a minute. But Abram was living in a land which then was known as Mesopotamia, is modern day Iraq, and I'll be more specific about that in a bit. But this divine being spoke to Abram and called him out and said to him, I want you to walk until I tell you to stop. And then he went to his wife Sarai and said, I've met this divine being has spoken to me. I don't know this divine being, but he wants us to walk until he tells us to stop. And if I were teaching this course face-to-face and in a regular 16-week sort of session, I would ask the next question, and I'll pose it to you all just because it seems an important question. Abram and Sarai are living in then Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq. They don't know this divine being. It's not a divine being that they have worshipped or followed or whatever. And it says to this person, Abram, hey, I want you to walk until I tell you to stop. And when I tell you to stop, you're going to find a land full of milk and honey, and so forth. And he goes to tell his wife this. Now, if this was a modern day scenario and you all went to your family and said, hey, some God or being from the realms of the supernatural came and spoke to me last night and said, I want you to walk until I tell you to stop, probably most of your families would tell you you're crazy, and they would not support this idea. But Abram and Sarai decide to do this. And this is why they are known as the father and mother of the Abrahamic faith tradition, because they placed all their faith all their sort of life and security in the hands of this unknown God. And so they took this sort of leap of faith, that we might say. All right. Yahweh is simultaneously a universal God, meaning the creator of the entire universe, and a national God, the God of the people of Israel. And so this makes Yahweh a particular type of God. Now, in the time frame when Judaism began to come into existence as a religious tradition, there were national gods aplenty. And so, and there were personal gods. So people had their own personal gods, people had national gods, but there was not really a notion of a creator God that was universal to all of humanity, that was also a national God. And so one of the unique features of Judaism is that their God, Yahweh, represented both of these things. All right. So Jews have been careful to distinguish themselves from all non-Jews. And they speak of non-Jews collectively as Gentiles or Goim, which means nations. And so this isn't a pejorative term. Anybody that wasn't a Jew is a Gentile. And while it's possible for non-Jews to become part of Judaism, it's not possible for their religion to pass from Jews to other people. For Judaism is not transferable. So in the absence of a specific ethnic group, there could be no Judaism. And, for those of you that have studied history, this is why the Holocaust was of particular significance, because Hitler was really trying to exterminate not just the people, but also the faith itself, because in exterminating Jews, you would exterminate Judaism as a religion. And this is a unique element of Judaism compared to other religious traditions. It is both an ethnic identity as well as a religious identity. And so one can't separate those two. And as I said, you can convert to Judaism, at least in certain Jewish traditions, that's possible. Not all Jewish traditions believe in conversion, but you can do that. But you can't go the other direction. And this is why Judaism is not an evangelistic religion like Christianity or Islam per se, because of this ethnic identity. So it isn't at its core a religion that is evangelistic per se. All right, sacred text of Judaism. Foremost among the sacred text of Judaism is the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is what Christians call the Old Testament, or in what you might say in modern day language, the Hebrew Bible. It's important to understand that the Tanakh is made up of 24 books. And you might say to me, well, if you're a Christian, you might say, well, there are 39 books in the Old Testament in Christianity. And that's because of the way Christians, particularly Protestants, because Catholics have additional books in the Old Testament, but it's the division of the books that Protestants engaged in. So the 24 books of the Tanakh are the same as the 39 Old Testament books of the Protestant Bible. Christians chose to divide some books up into a series of books rather than just one text. Anyway, the most important of these 24 books is the 5 books known as the Torah. And the Torah is made up of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And these are the most significant books of the Hebrew scriptures, or the Tanakh. And Torah means teaching. This is where we find the creation story in Genesis. This is where we find the Exodus story from Egypt in the book of Exodus. Leviticus, this is where we find the story about the Levitical codes, and in Numbers and Deuteronomy are where we find the stories about the journey to the promised land and so forth, and also other codes as well. All right. After the Tanakh, the most important religious texts in Judaism are the works of Jewish teachers known as rabbis. And the first works of this rabbinic literature are what we call Mishnah. In Mishnah, the early Mishnah were edited in Palestine beginning in the 3rd century BCE. And these are legal texts. So Mishnah were basically legal texts regarding the writings from the Tanakh. And so rabbis began to write larger volumes on their interpretations, really, of the Tanakh, and particularly Torah. And that's what Mishnah is. And we'll talk about, you'll see how that works. The Mishnah was later expanded and analyzed in a document called Talmud. And the Talmud synthesizes the teaching of the Tanakh and the Mishnah with rabbinic scholarship and interpretation. And so the Talmud is really a drawing together of both Tanakh and Mishnah. And so you can imagine this becomes a great volume. And the most authoritative Talmud is the Babylonian version, which was written in 500 CE. So there's a Palestinian version of the Talmud that appeared in around 400 CE, and there's a Babylonian version that appeared around in 500 CE. And even today, this is what rabbinic scholars often, when they're reading and discussing what the Bible means, they're using Talmudic writings to determine that. Today, modern day Jewish law has its basis in the Babylonian Talmud. And so the Jewish law of today is really this Talmudic commentary. And so if you study Judaism and you study Jewish ethical teachings, they're really based on these Talmudic writings. All right. I'm going to talk briefly about Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism for a moment, and then we'll go back to the larger story. Because most of us are familiar with these three branches of Judaism and the modern branches. There's also Hasidic Judaism, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the three main branches of Judaism are Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed. And these branches of Judaism are defined by the extent to which they affirm the Torah and the Talmud as works inspired directly by God. Now notice, they're defined by the extent in which they affirm Torah and Talmud to be works inspired directly from God. Orthodox Jews hold that contents of the Torah were revealed by God directly and literally to the prophet Moses. And so the history tells us or that Moses wrote the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what the history tells us. And therefore, Orthodox Jews hold that the Torah was inspired and directly, from God to Moses and written down. Conservative and Reform Jews see that they hold less strict to that direct revelation. And they also see Talmudic writing, in a different way. The Talmud is regarded as sacred and authoritative by Orthodox Jews, less so by conservatives, and has more marginal importance in Reform Judaism. So Orthodox Jews hold sort of this literal expression of the Torah, and then also that the Talmud is really also inspired by God. Conservative Jews are a little less inspirational from God on both the Torah and the Talmud, and Reform Jews really don't pay a lot of attention to Talmudic writings at all. All right. So as I mentioned, Abraham was uh, a nomadic herdsman living in Mesopotamia in a region between the Tigris and Euphrates River. So that's modern day Iraq, and that's where Abram and Sarai lived, and that's where they journeyed from. So imagine this, they went from modern day Iraq on foot all the way to what we would call today modern day Israel. So they crossed Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria and so forth. So this was a long journey on foot. And Abraham promised his loyalty to this God that came and spoke to him. In return for his loyalty, God promised that he and his descendants would be given this land flowing with milk and honey. The name Israel itself it was first ascribed to Jacob, Abraham's grandson. So Jacob was the son of Isaac, who was Abraham and Sarah's second son. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But anyway, Jacob and his brother Esau were twins of Sarah, of Isaac, of Isaac. And Jacob wrestled with this stranger in the night, as the story tells us in the book of Genesis. And this stranger, it has either been conceived as an angelic messenger, as God's self, or possibly Esau, who was Jacob's twin brother. And Jacob was the younger of the twins, so he came out second, and he stole his brother's birthright. So Esau was supposed to inherit Isaac's land and all of that, and Jacob did this. And anyway, in the wrestling with the stranger in the nighttime, the stranger and Jacob wrestled to a draw. Right as the day was about to break, the stranger recognized that Jacob and he were at a draw, and he wounded Jacob in the hip. And in that process, Jacob demanded to know who the stranger was, and the stranger wouldn't reveal himself, but he gave Jacob a new name, Israel, which means he who struggles with God. And so this notion actually is a profound notion. So in Judaism, struggling with God, wrestling with God, debating with God is actually part of the religious tradition. And so not only does the name Israel itself mean wrestle with God, the people's identity is tied up that way. And so we see this, if you read the Hebrew scriptures, you'll see on numerous occasions where different people actually question and argue with God and barter with God. And this is something that is unique to Judaism in a way, particularly of the Abrahamic faith traditions. Generally, Christians and Muslims don't typically argue or struggle with God, if you will, in the same way Judaism does. But that's how the name Israel came to be. And so Jacob is considered the father of Israel, if you will. Moving on, we have the escape from Egypt. That escape from Egypt is what we call the Exodus, and that's recounted in the book of Exodus. And how the Israelites got to Egypt in the first place really had to do with a famine that takes place in the end of the book of Genesis. The family of Joseph, some of you may know that name, his brothers, they're didn't like Joseph. He was the youngest one. They beat him up and left him for dead, and then they ultimately sold him to a caravan. Uh, and this caravan ultimately brought him to Egypt. And there he became a servant in Pharaoh's house. And basically, he became a servant in Pharaoh's house. And then he was recognized as a dream interpreter. And this is where Joseph's fame becomes. Pharaoh called him to his court because his magicians and dream analysts were not able to interpret the dream that he was having. And Joseph rightly interpreted the dreams that there was going to be 7 years of plenty, and therefore the Pharaoh needed to build storage units and grain bins and so forth, because following those 7 years of plenty were going to be 7 years of famine. And because Joseph rightly interpreted that, Egypt, when the famine hit, had enough food and water and so forth to care for its people. And Joseph rose to the level of basically vice pharaoh, if you will. In that same time of famine, his brothers decided to travel because they heard that there was food in Egypt. They decided to travel to Egypt, and they went to Pharaoh's court to beg for mercy. And lo and behold, who did they find at Pharaoh's court but their brother, who they tried to kill and had sold into slavery. And they assumed their brother's going to take and kill them. And instead, he protects them and brings the entire family to Egypt. And then there's a long period where the Israelites and the Egyptians live in harmony. And then the story goes, there was a Pharaoh that rose up that didn't know Joseph. And this is when the Israelites become enslaved. And then they're enslaved for centuries. Moses is born, and Moses rises up in Pharaoh's house. He's a Hebrew, but he doesn't know this because he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter as an infant, as the story goes. And it's Moses and Aaron, his brother, who go to Pharaoh, and this is where the plagues, if any of you know this story about the 10 plagues, this is where the 10 plagues come from. And after each plague, Pharaoh's heart becomes harder, and so forth. And eventually, the last plague is the killing of all the children, the Egyptian children of 2 years or younger. And this doesn't mean just the children, it also means animals as well. And this is where the Passover story comes from. The Israelites are told to take blood from the lamb and mark their doorposts with the blood, and the angel of death will pass over their house. And so they do not suffer the death, and it's only the houses that don't have the blood on the doorpost. And then the Israelites flee from Pharaoh, cross what is called in the Bible the Red Sea, but what archaeologists have determined is really the Reed Sea, which was this marshy area. And in that, God makes a dry place for the Israelites to cross over. And then when Pharaoh's armies cross, they're drowned. And then they wander for 40 years in the desert, leading up to coming into the promised land. So this is the whole Exodus story. And so every year, Passover just occurred for Jews the same time. Around the same time Christians were celebrating Easter, Passover was taking place. And this is the story that Jews recount at the Passover every year, this miraculous saving. And so Moses is a savior figure for the Israelites. All right. Moses is the one that asks Yahweh for the name, and Yahweh says, I am. And this is what the meaning of Yahweh is, I am. And so Moses knows Yahweh as I am. And if you know Hebrew only uses consonants. So, and consonants are also have numeric value. So the name Yahweh in Hebrew is YHWH. WH without any vowels. Um, and so, and when Jews write God in English, they write it without the O. And so they don't pronounce it because the name is sacred. And so it's important for us. So you might see sometimes if you see Hebrew translated into English and you see God, you'll often see G and a dash and D, and that's because they don't pronounce that due to the sacredness. All right, I'm going to stop there. Any questions so far? Are we all okay?
Good.
All good.
All right. All right. Okay. So, during that Exodus period, this is when Moses goes to Mount Sinai and receives those commandments that we now call the Ten Commandments from Yahweh. It's also during this period where the covenant laws in the book of Leviticus begin to take shape. And so those are known as the Mosaic covenant or Mosaic laws. And so those entire laws come under that rubric. And really, they are what shaped the nation of Israel. All right. The next important thing we need to talk about is the Ark of the Covenant. So in the time of Moses and Joshua and then the judges, Israel worshiped a movable God. And the Israelites housed God, Yahweh, in what was known as the Ark of the Covenant. So inside this Ark was the actual covenant, so the scrolls of the covenant. There were some other things inside the Ark as well, but the Ark was a wooden chest covered in gold and adorned with images of heavenly beings. And if anyone other than the high priest touched the Ark of the Covenant, he or she died. Now, there were particular people that were responsible for carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And if you read in the Torah, you get a very specific construction of the Ark of the Covenant. There were poles that were designed and so forth, and how this could be moved and who could move it and so forth. Whenever they stopped and didn't move, they would create a tabernacle. And this was an elaborate tent that they also stitched together and would erect. In the Ark of the Covenant was placed inside the tabernacle. And so when the Israelites were wandering and moving about, they were carrying this Ark of the Covenant with them. And so they were carrying in their mind and their belief system the physical presence of God. So, if any of you have seen some of the Indiana Jones movies, and they're looking for the Ark of the Covenant, this is what they're searching for, is this box. And this box, literally, not only did it carry the presence of God, when they went into battle, when they go into battle, when they move into the promised land, they carry the ark into battle with them, to carry the presence of God with them, to ensure that they'll be victorious. And so this ark becomes vitally important. But it's a movable object, so they can carry God wherever they go. Eventually, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, David decides when he is lifted up as king and becomes king of Israel, that God shouldn't be living in a tent in an ark when he has a palace. So he envisions building a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. It's really Solomon that actually carries through. And the Ark of the Covenant is placed inside the temple in what is known as the Holy of Holies. And only, again, the high priest can go in there. So eventually, God stops being a movable God and moves into this temple in Jerusalem. All right. And so this gets us to the monarchy in the first temple period. And the monarchy replaced the age of the judges. And so the age of the judges ruled over the 12 tribes. And the monarchy period comes about in the 10th century BCE. And the Bible tells us that Saul was the first king over over the kingdoms. And Saul ruled over the kingdom of Israel and Judah. Israel was the northern kingdom, and Judah was the southern kingdom. It became more unified under David, and then after the fall of Solomon, it was broken up. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. But Saul was anointed king, and being anointed means that he was God's anointed one, which in Hebrew is the word Messiah. And so that's simply what God's anointed means, is Messiah. And so this is what both Judaism is expecting, the return of the Messiah, and Christianity believes that Jesus is that Messiah. But it simply means God's anointed. And therefore, Saul sat on the throne and represented God as it was the earthly representation of God. Saul started out as a great king, and all seemed well with Saul's rule. And then Saul disobeyed God, and Saul disappointed God. The Bible actually tells us that Saul disappointed God. This is an important concept because the notion of disappointment is a human emotion, meaning that Saul failed God. And we typically don't think of God functioning this way, but the Hebrews saw that this real deep understanding that God had this kind of pain and angst, and therefore, while Saul was still on the throne, God sends Samuel out to find a replacement, a new king. And the story has it that Samuel is directed to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. And Jesse had a number of sons. And Samuel arrives telling Jesse that he is here on important business and wants to see the sons. And the first son comes before Samuel, and he's determined not to be appropriate and adequate, and subsequently down through. And then Samuel says to Jesse, "Do you have any other sons?" And Jesse says, "I have one, my youngest, David, who's a shepherd boy out in the field, but he's too young and he's a shepherd boy." And Samuel says, "Bring him and have him come." And young David comes, and God says to Samuel, "This is the one." And in a secret ceremony, Samuel anoints David. And so again, the process has begun that David is anointed king at age 12-ish or 13. He doesn't become king immediately, and eventually moves to the royal household, and is actually like a butler to Saul, unbeknownst that he's already been anointed. And this is the story where you get David and Goliath, if any of you are familiar with that. And David uses his sling and throws a rock which embeds itself in the skull of Goliath, the giant, and he falls. And eventually, David supersedes Saul as king and becomes, in Israel's estimation, the greatest of all kings. His son Solomon follows, and it's Solomon that builds the temple and moves the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And once the Ark of the Covenant is installed in the temple, this becomes the central place of worship. And so this is not only where Jews go to worship and pray, it's also where they go to offer sacrifices. And as I mentioned, the Ark of the Covenant resides in the Holy of Holies. All right. Couple more things, and we will be done for today. The kingdom is divided after Solomon's fall and these are the 12 tribes. And Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes. So these are the historic 12 tribes. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Daniel, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. Uh, and after Solomon's reign, you'll see why I mention these in a moment. But after Solomon's reign, the nation is divided into a northern and southern kingdom by a civil war. And the northern kingdom is known as Israel. And the northern kingdom is also known as the 10 lost tribes. And the southern kingdom, and so those 10 lost tribes are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Daniel, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and Joseph. The southern kingdom was made up of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And so this is where we get the notion of the Lion of Judah. And Jerusalem is in Judah in the southern kingdom. And so the southern kingdom becomes the central place of worship and sacrifice. Now, mind you, the northern kingdom also constructed a temple where they did worship and sacrifice as well. But this becomes a conflict later on between the Israelites. And because the Ark of the Covenant resided in the temple in Jerusalem. The northern and southern kingdoms were eventually conquered by armies from Mesopotamia. And in 722 BCE, Israel, the northern kingdom, was conquered by the Assyrians, and that effectively ended their history. And this is where the notion of the lost tribes comes into effect. And then in 586 BCE, Judah, the southern kingdom, fell to the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. And that was when the temple was destroyed and the great diaspora took place. All right. I'm going to stop there. Any questions? We'll pick this up tomorrow. But if there are any questions right now, feel free to shoot. You good, Alec?
Yeah, I think I'm all set.
All right. Bo, you good?
Yeah, all good.
All right. John, you all good?
Yes, sir. I'm good.
Josh?
Yes, sir.
All right. Danny, you all good?
Solid.
All right. So tomorrow, I have tomorrow sort of finishing Judaism and starting Christianity. We'll see. We'll definitely finish Judaism tomorrow. Whether we actually start Christianity or not, we'll see. Be mindful that your first response papers due Friday and your first paper on religious tradition is due Friday as well. As I mentioned at the start, if you have any questions, just let me know. We can talk about it, and take care, and I'll see you all later.
All right. Thank you.